All right, guys, so in this episode of Bonsai-U, we're gonna do another follow-up on this shortleaf pine or Pinus echinata. So you guys will recall that we did an initial styling video on this tree at the beginning of 2023. The tree was then potted up in this container in another video in March of 2023. We did a decandling video on this as an experiment with this species because we weren't sure if it was actually going to be a true double flush pine in June of 2023. And now we are coming up on the end of July, and you can see that the tree has put out an unbelievable amount of secondary growth. So I think it's fair to say that we can put Pinus echinata or shortleaf pine in the double flush pine category, and that this will be something that we can do yearly going forward. Now, what I want to do in this episode is walk you through what I think are going to be the best secondary steps for treating this second flush of candle growth on the tree. There's some unique characteristics about this growth that are a little bit different than your standard, say, Japanese black pine or Japanese red pine. So I'm going to bring the camera a little bit closer and we're going to walk you through the process of candle selection. And again, this is going to be somewhat experimental with this species because this is all brand new here in the United States. But we're going to see if we can kind of combine the normal or usual secondary candle pruning techniques that we do with double flush pines with a little bit of variation relative to the growth that's actually emerging on this shortleaf pine. So let's bring the camera in closer and take a look at that secondary growth. All right, so let's take a look at our directional branch down here. You can see out at the end here, we actually have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 candles all emerging from the same cut site where we initially removed one candle back in June. Now this is pretty typical when it comes to double flush pines to have anywhere from 2 to 5 secondary candles emerging from the cut site of one candle. So that part of this whole process here is actually basically the same as a Japanese black pine. What's interesting here though is just how long though these secondary candles have become only in about 6 weeks since the tree was decandled. Normally secondary growth tends to be significantly weaker than the first flush of growth because you're removing that first flush of growth that the tree's put out a ton of energy to build to begin with. You weaken the tree through decandling and the secondary growth ends up being quite a bit smaller. But you can see all of these candles on here are at least 2 inches, if not 3 inches long. So what's that, like 4 to 6 centimeters long, which is pretty crazy. And we're not even to the end of the growing season. Like this growth obviously hasn't come out and hardened off quite yet. It's not lignified quite yet. So these are going to continue to elongate, I think, and we're going to end up with really, really long growth. So what we're going to do with this, first and foremost, is treat it like we do with any other double flush pine. And we're going to cut back to the 2 most even strength candles in this area, and also the 2 most laterally oriented. So for the most part, say 1, 2, 3, 4 here are actually pretty much the same size. We've got one slightly smaller one right back here. But because these 4 are basically the same size, I want to select the 2 that are most lateral in this case, which are going to be these 2 guys dipping downward here. This makes wiring and developing the trees much easier. So we're going to go through and completely remove all of these other candles back to the base here. And then to shorten the length of these candles here, we're going to go ahead and prune these back. But what's really interesting and very strange about the shortleaf pine here is that at the base of each of these main needles, it looks like there's another set of needles at the base of each one that if I cut back, it's going to turn into another set of candle growth, possibly even in this same growing season, which is very, very strange. You don't see that with Japanese black pine or red pine. So what I'm going to do here, because that's the case, I'm actually going to take these candles back pretty severely. I'm going to push them back. Normally we'd go maybe about halfway. Say if it were a black pine and some of the candles were a little bit too long, at this time of year we'd maybe cut them back in half or to an average length. I'm going to go ahead and get pretty extreme with these. Since it looks like we have buds already formed at the base of each of these, we're going to push all of these back to basically, I'd say probably a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch long. Something along those lines there. I'm actually going to go ahead and remove a lot of last year's needles from here as well. And we're going to do this across the entire tree to push the length of this growth back. So again, this is all experimental. I think it's probably going to flush again and put out probably multiple buds here at the end and maybe even new candles at the end. And we might have to treat this again a little bit later in the season, but we'll play that by ear for now. But right now I'm going to go through the whole tree, cut back to 2s everywhere to avoid swelling. And then we're going to cut the elongated candles back to an average length of about, we'll say 3/4 of an inch across the tree. So here is our shortleaf pine after the secondary candle work in late July. So you can see that the tree looks a little bit like a skint chicken all over again. I took off so much growth on the plant. That's because, again, it tripled, quadrupled, and even 5 times itself in certain areas. So, removing that back to 2s is obviously going to give you a much more sort of sparse look to the tree. But because I'm doing this relatively early in the summer, at the end of July here, there's still plenty of time for the remaining needles that are on the tree to continue to elongate and be much more in proportion with the overall size of the tree. So in general, when it comes to doing secondary candle work on a double flush pine, typically I wait until the growth has fully come out, completely hardened off, and then you can really tell what are going to be the strong, medium, and weak candles, and you can select back to an average size across the tree. But because this tree was growing so profusely and those candles had extended so far out, I figured that it was better to do this secondary work a little bit earlier in the season. So like mid to late July seems to be, at least for this particular tree and maybe even for this species in general going forward, the best timing. Whereas if I'm working with a Japanese black pine or Japanese red pine, I typically wait on those until end of August, early September through September to do the secondary candle work on those plants. So in terms of pruning back the length of the candles as well, like I said before, you can do that on Japanese black pine, Japanese red pines if you've got a few candles that have gotten a little bit overly elongated. I would recommend with those to do those sometime a little bit earlier as well, like again late July, maybe even early August, to give enough time for the new terminal bud to form at the end of that candle. So doing it at this time of year on this tree will give us several months between now and the end of the growing season in, say, October, early November, for that new terminal bud to form at the end of each candle that I cut back. Now, that being said, this tree may be completely different because it looks like we've got all those buds further back down the candle that are already there. This tree might even try to flush one more time this year, which would be totally crazy. So what I'm going to do in terms of fertilization on this plant is none for the rest of the season until the growth really does start to harden off. If though I notice by, let's say, early September that the needles that are left on the tree haven't elongated enough to be in proportion with the tree, I might throw on some fertilizer at that point to make sure that they push just a little bit longer before the tree goes dormant. But if everything looks like it's in proportion, I'm going to hold off on fertilizing this guy until everything really fully hardens off, hopefully sometime in mid-September, so that'll be about the right time to do it. But again, this is all experimental with this species. So it's going to get a little confusing, I'm sure, with what I've talked about in the past, what we're talking about now in relation to other double flush pines. But just keep this in mind. All experimental. We're just testing these things out. This is what comes along with testing new species in your given environment, native trees, whether that be in the United States or in Europe or somewhere in the southern hemisphere, down in Australia, for example. Although I don't know if you guys have many pines available to do this with. But in any case, these are the things to look out for. Hopefully you can apply these techniques to your trees going forward. Even if it's not an echinata, if it's something new that you're just experimenting with, try it out, see if it works. Sometimes it works, sometimes it fails, but that's the process of building better bonsai. So thank you guys for checking out this episode. Look forward to seeing all of you next time around. And until then, take care.